The clock struck midnight as Emma tied her apron and made her way to the electronics section. She never minded working the night shift at Walmart. It was quiet, almost peaceful. The aisles were empty, and the hum of the fluorescent lights created a strange sense of calm. But that night, something felt off. It was the kind of feeling that crept up your spine, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. She brushed it off, blaming her overactive imagination and lack of sleep. After all, what could possibly go wrong at a Walmart in the middle of the night? Emma's job was simple: restock the shelves, clean the display cases, and ensure everything was in order for the morning crew. But as she walked through the aisles, she noticed something unusual. A trail of muddy footprints leading from the back entrance, weaving through the store and ending near the fitting rooms. She frowned. No one was supposed to be here at this hour, except for the night crew. But as far as she knew, she was the only one working that night. Curiosity got the best of her, and she followed the footprints, her shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. The trail led to the fitting rooms, where the door to one of the stalls was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if someone had just passed through. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She felt an uneasy chill as she approached the door, her fingers trembling as she reached out to push it open. The stall was empty, but the muddy footprints ended there, right in front of the mirror. The air was cold, almost suffocating, and the fluorescent lights above flickered ominously. A strange feeling washed over her, like she was being watched. She glanced at her reflection, and for a brief moment she thought she saw someone standing behind her. A dark figure with hollow eyes staring back. She spun around, but the room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the echo of her own breathing. Emma's heart raced as she backed away, her eyes darting around the room. She wanted to believe it was just her imagination, but the footprints, the cold air, and that eerie reflection were too real to ignore. Something was very wrong. After the unsettling encounter in the fitting room, Emma tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. She returned to the electronics section, hoping to distract herself by restocking shelves and organizing displays. But the eerie sensation followed her. As she arranged the video games on the rack, she heard it. A whisper, faint and distant, echoing through the empty aisles. She froze, her hands trembling as she listened. Emma. Her name echoed through the store, soft and haunting. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart raced as she gripped the edge of the display stand, her knuckles turning white. The voice was familiar, yet distorted, like someone she knew was calling out from a distant place. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Maybe it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind. But the whispers grew louder, more persistent. Emma, come play with me. The voice was coming from the toy aisle. She could hear the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the empty store. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound, her footsteps echoing as she walked down the aisles. When she reached the toy section, she found the aisle completely empty, but the laughter continued, echoing from the shelves. The toys seemed to stare at her with cold, lifeless eyes, their faces twisted into eerie smiles. Suddenly, one of the dolls moved, its head turning slowly to face her. Its glassy eyes locked onto hers, and its mouth opened, emitting a distorted giggle. The laughter grew louder, more menacing as the other toys began to move, their limbs twitching unnaturally. Emma stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched in horror as the dolls began to whisper her name, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. Emma, come play. Emma ... She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty aisles as the laughter followed her, growing louder and more distorted. She didn't dare look back, afraid of what she might see. Shaken by the haunting whispers and the moving dolls, Emma rushed to the security office. She needed proof that she wasn't losing her mind, that something truly sinister was happening inside the store. She unlocked the door to the security room and sat in front of the monitors, her hands trembling as she rewound the footage from the fitting room and toy aisle. Her heart raced as she watched herself walk through the store, following the muddy footprints. But then she saw it, the shadowy figure standing behind her in the fitting room, its hollow eyes staring at her through the mirror. The figure stood motionless, its face twisted into a sinister grin as it watched her leave. Emma covered her mouth, stifling a scream as she continued to watch the footage. The shadow followed her, lingering just out of sight, always watching but never revealing itself. It moved with an unnatural grace, almost gliding across the floor. When she reached the toy aisle, the cameras captured the dolls moving on their own, their heads twisting as they whispered her name. The shadowy figure stood at the end of the aisle, its eyes glowing with a menacing red light. Suddenly, the monitors flickered and the shadowy figure turned its head, staring directly into the camera. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the screen, locking onto Emma's gaze. Then, the monitors went black. The air grew cold, and the room was filled with a low, guttural growl. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as the door behind her creaked open. She turned slowly, her heart pounding as she faced the darkness beyond the doorway. The shadowy figure stood there, its hollow eyes glowing red as it reached out with skeletal fingers. Emma's body froze as she locked eyes with the shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes glowing an ominous red. Her breath hitched, fear rooting her to the spot. The room grew colder, the air heavy with a dark, suffocating presence. The figure moved, its skeletal fingers curling as it took a step forward, its body gliding silently across the floor. Emma's heart pounded, adrenaline surging through her veins as the primal instinct to run took over. She bolted out of the security room, her footsteps echoing through the empty aisles. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting twisted shadows that danced across the shelves. The aisles seemed to stretch endlessly, the familiar layout of the store warping into a nightmarish labyrinth. Emma's chest burned as she ran, her vision blurring with tears of terror. Behind her, the air grew colder, and she could hear the faint whisper of her name. "Emma, you can't hide." The voice was distorted, inhuman, echoing through the store as if coming from all directions. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel the shadow closing in, its presence suffocating, its hollow eyes burning into her back. She turned down the grocery aisle, her shoes skidding across the polished floor as she collided with a shelf of canned goods. The cans tumbled to the floor, rolling across the aisle with a metallic clatter. Emma's heart raced as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around for an escape. Then she saw it. A door labeled "Employees Only" at the end of the aisle. Without hesitation, she ran toward it, her muscles screaming as she pushed herself to go faster. But just as she reached the door, the air grew frigid and the lights above burst, plunging the aisle into darkness. A cold, skeletal hand wrapped around her shoulder, its icy grip sending a shock of pain through her body. Emma screamed, twisting away as she felt the sharp claws dig into her skin. She turned to face the figure, its face inches from hers. Its hollow eyes glowed with an unholy light, its twisted grin revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You're mine, Emma!" she screamed, throwing herself against the door as it burst open. She stumbled into the employee break room, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands shook as she locked the door, pressing her back against it as the shadow's guttural growl echoed from the other side. Emma's chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath, her back pressed firmly against the door. Her body trembled, the icy pain from the shadow's touch still lingering on her shoulder. She looked around the break room, her eyes scanning the small space cluttered with chairs, a table, and a refrigerator. The overhead lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twist and writhe along the walls. The air was cold, heavy with a dark presence that made it hard to breathe. Emma's heart raced as the whispering began again, echoing from the walls. "Emma, there's no escape." Her eyes darted to the vents above, where the whispers seemed to be crawling through the metal grates. She watched in horror as black smoke seeped from the vents, swirling into the room and coalescing into the shape of the shadowy figure. Its hollow eyes glowed red as it materialized before her, its skeletal fingers curling as it reached out. Emma stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and crashing to the floor. The shadow loomed over her, its body distorting and twisting, its face contorting into a grotesque mask of hatred. Its hollow eyes bored into her soul, paralyzing her with fear. The walls began to close in, the room warping and shrinking as the darkness enveloped her. The air grew colder, and the shadows danced along the walls, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Join us. Become one of us." Emma's body felt heavy, her limbs numb as the shadow's skeletal fingers reached for her. Her vision blurred as the cold darkness wrapped around her, suffocating her, pulling her into the void. But just as the shadows closed in, she heard a faint sound, the chime of the store's closing announcement echoing from the intercom. The familiar voice broke through the darkness, momentarily disrupting the shadows. The figure recoiled, its hollow eyes flickering as the light from the hallway seeped into the room. Seizing the opportunity, Emma scrambled to her feet, her body shaking as she lunged for the door. She threw it open and ran, the cold air biting at her skin as she raced down the hallway, the shadow's enraged howl echoing behind her. Emma's lungs burned as she ran through the maze-like aisles, the shadow's enraged growl echoing through the store. The lights above flickered erratically, casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach out for her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. The shadow was everywhere, its presence suffocating, its hollow eyes burning into her soul. Emma's vision blurred as panic consumed her, her mind racing for a way out. She stumbled into the electronics section, her eyes locking onto the security camera monitors. An idea sparked in her mind, a desperate, reckless plan that was her only hope. She ran to the display wall of flashlights and grabbed as many as she could, turning them on and aiming the beams at the shadows around her. The light cut through the darkness, the shadows recoiling, their twisted forms hissing as they melted away. But the shadowy figure remained, its hollow eyes narrowing as it advanced, unfazed by the light. Emma's heart sank as the figure lunged at her, its skeletal fingers reaching out. She screamed, throwing herself to the side as the shadow crashed into the display, shattering the glass and sending shards flying. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes locking onto the store's emergency exit at the end of the aisle. Without hesitation, she ran, the shadow's enraged howl echoing behind her. She burst through the exit, the cold night air stinging her face as she stumbled into the parking lot. The shadow loomed in the doorway, its form distorting as it tried to cross the threshold. But the light from the street lamps held it back, the glow burning its twisted shape. The figure let out a piercing shriek, its body contorting as it dissolved into smoke, vanishing into the night. Emma collapsed to her knees, her body trembling as she watched the darkness fade. The shadow was gone, but its hollow eyes haunted her memory, a reminder that some nightmares never truly end. Mark never believed in ghosts. To him, the late-night tales his coworkers shared were just stories meant to pass the time during the graveyard shift at Walmart. But tonight was different. As he clocked in at midnight, the store was eerily silent, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound echoing through the vast, empty aisles. The air felt heavy, colder than usual, and Mark shivered as he walked towards the cleaning supplies aisle. He pulled his jacket closer, brushing off the creeping chill that ran down his spine. It was just another shift, he reminded himself, nothing out of the ordinary. He grabbed the mop and bucket, his footsteps echoing as he made his way to aisle 13. Aisle 13, the one his coworkers always whispered about. They said it was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a woman who had died there years ago. Mark scoffed at the thought. Ghosts weren't real. It was just an aisle like any other. But as he turned the corner, his heart stopped. The aisle was freezing, a mist clinging to the floor, swirling around his feet. The shelves were empty, the products seemingly vanished, leaving behind only dust and cobwebs. He took a cautious step forward, his breath visible in the icy air. The lights above flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced along the walls. Mark's eyes widened as the shadows began to move, twisting and contorting into the shape of a woman. Her long hair floated around her pale face, her hollow eyes staring right at him. A cold whisper echoed through the aisle, chilling him to the bone. "Why did you leave me?" Mark's heart raced as the ghostly figure floated closer, her skeletal fingers reaching out. He stumbled back, his body trembling as he turned to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The air grew colder, the mist rising, wrapping around his legs and holding him in place. He could feel her cold breath on his neck, her voice a haunting whisper. "You can't leave. You're mine now." Mark's body trembled as the mist tightened around his legs, cold and suffocating. He struggled to move, his heart pounding as the ghostly woman floated closer, her hollow eyes locked on his. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her long hair moving as if underwater. She opened her mouth, her voice echoing like a distant scream. "Why did you leave me?" Mark's head spun, his vision blurring as memories flooded his mind. Images of a young woman, her laughter echoing through the store, her smile bright and warm. He didn't recognize her, but the pain in her voice was real, a sorrow that gripped his heart. The shadows around her began to shift, forming scenes from the past. Mark watched in horror as the aisle transformed, revealing an old version of the store. The shelves were stocked with outdated products, the floor covered in dust. A young woman stood at the register, her face familiar, her eyes filled with hope. He realized then that he was seeing her final moments. The air grew colder as the scene played out before him. A man storming into the store, his face twisted in anger. There were no sounds, only the woman's terrified expression as he lunged at her, his hands closing around her throat. Mark's stomach turned as he watched her struggle, her face turning pale as she gasped for air. Her eyes locked onto his, pleading, her mouth forming the words, "Help me." But he was powerless, frozen in place as the shadows continued to replay her death. The mist swirled around her lifeless body, her spirit rising from the ground, her face twisted in pain. Her hollow eyes burned with sorrow as she looked at Mark, her voice a whisper. "You didn't save me. You let me die." Mark shook his head, his voice trembling. I wasn't here. I don't even know you." her face contorted, anger flashing in her hollow eyes. The shadows around her grew darker, the mist swirling violently as her voice rose to a scream. "You left me. You all left me." The lights above shattered, plunging the aisle into darkness. Mark's heart raced as the shadows enveloped him, the cold mist wrapping around his body, pulling him towards her. He struggled, his body numb as her skeletal fingers closed around his throat, her grip cold as death. Mark's vision blurred as the ghost's icy grip tightened around his throat. The cold was unbearable, sinking into his bones as her hollow eyes bore into his. Her face was twisted in anger, her voice echoing like a chorus of screams. "You left me to die. Now you'll stay with me. Forever." His body felt heavy, his strength fading as the shadows wrapped around him, their cold tendrils pulling him deeper into the darkness. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, his voice lost in the freezing air. The mist swirled violently, the shadows twisting into faces. Distorted, screaming faces that surrounded him, their hollow eyes pleading for mercy. Mark's heart raced as he realized they were all victims, trapped souls who had fallen prey to the ghost's wrath. He saw faces he recognized, former employees who had mysteriously disappeared, their hollow eyes staring at him with sorrow and anger. Their voices echoed in his mind, a cacophony of whispers. "She took us. She'll take you too." Mark's body trembled as the shadows tightened around him, cold fingers clawing at his skin. His vision darkened as the ghost leaned in, her skeletal face inches from his, her cold breath brushing against his lips. "You belong to me now." His world spun as the darkness consumed him, the shadows pulling him deeper into the void. He could feel his soul slipping away, his body growing colder as the ghost's hollow eyes burned into his. Just as he felt himself fading, a blinding light burst through the darkness. The store's emergency lights flickered on, their bright glow piercing through the shadows. The ghost let out an unholy shriek, her body distorting as the light burned her, the mist evaporating. Mark fell to the floor, gasping for air as the cold grip released him. He looked up just in time to see the ghost's face contort in agony, her hollow eyes flickering before she dissolved into smoke, vanishing into the shadows. He lay there trembling, his body numb as the store returned to normal. The aisle was silent, the shelves stocked as if nothing had happened. But he knew the truth. She was still there, waiting in the shadows, her hollow eyes watching, always watching. Samantha had always hated the closing shift. The long hours, the eerie silence of the empty store, and the flickering fluorescent lights made Walmart feel like a haunted maze. But she needed the money, and tonight was no different. She sighed as she glanced at the clock. 11:55 p.m., 5 minutes until closing. She was just about to lock the front door when she saw him. A man stood at the entrance, his face hidden beneath the hood of a tattered coat. He was tall, his shoulders hunched, and his hands were hidden in his pockets. Something about him sent a chill down her spine, but she shook it off. "We're closing in 5 minutes, sir," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't respond. He simply walked past her, his movements stiff, almost unnatural. As he passed, a cold breeze followed, making her shiver. Samantha watched as he walked down the aisle, his body swaying slightly, his head tilted at an odd angle. She felt a knot form in her stomach as he disappeared into the electronics section. Something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Her walkie-talkie crackled, breaking the silence. "Sam, you good? I'm about to lock up the back door." Her coworker Jason's voice echoed through the static. "Yeah, Just one last customer. He's in electronics. I'll lock up once he leaves." There was a pause before Jason responded, his voice low. "Be careful. It's the third time this week someone's shown up right before closing, and none of them were on the security cameras." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Jason's voice was serious. "I checked the footage. They don't show up, but you and I see them. Every time." Her blood ran cold as she turned towards the electronics aisle. It was empty. The man was gone, as if he had vanished into thin air. But the air was still cold, and she could feel eyes watching her. She stepped forward, her footsteps echoing through the empty aisle. The lights above flickered, the shadows growing darker, longer. A chill ran down her spine as she heard a whisper, soft and cold. "You're next." Samantha's heart raced as she ran down the aisle, her eyes darting around for any sign of the hooded man. But he was gone, vanished without a trace. The cold air lingered, a haunting reminder that he had been there. She grabbed her walkie-talkie, her voice trembling. "Jason, did you see where he went?" Static crackled before Jason's voice came through, sounding distant. "What are you talking about? There's no one on the cameras." Her stomach dropped as she glanced up at the security camera above. Its red light blinked, but when she looked at the monitor on the wall, the aisle was empty. She was staring right at the screen, but her own image was the only one visible. The man was nowhere to be seen. A cold whisper brushed against her ear, sending chills down her spine. "They can't see me, but I can see you." She spun around, her eyes wide, but the aisle was empty. The shadows danced along the walls, twisting into faces, distorted, hollow-eyed faces that watched her with silent screams. Her breath hitched as she realized they were moving, their mouths opening wide as if to swallow her whole. She stumbled back, her back hitting the shelf behind her, causing a box of electronics to crash to the floor. The sound echoed through the empty store, but the faces didn't flinch. They just watched, their hollow eyes burning into her soul. The lights flickered, and for a split second, the hooded man stood right in front of her, his face inches from hers. His eyes were pure black, empty voids that seemed to pull her in. His mouth opened unnaturally wide, his jaw cracking as his lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "You're trapped. Just like me." The lights flickered again, and he was gone, leaving behind only the cold, suffocating air. Samantha's body trembled as she slid to the floor, her heart pounding. She could still feel his cold breath on her face, his empty eyes watching her from the shadows. Samantha's legs felt heavy as she stumbled through the store, her mind racing. She had to find Jason, had to get out before the hooded man found her again. But every aisle looked the same, the shelves towering over her, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. The store felt different, larger, darker, like a maze that twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the shadows. She could hear whispers echoing through the aisles, soft and cold, calling her name. "Samantha, come play with us." Her heart raced as she quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing. She turned a corner and froze. The aisle was filled with mirrors, tall and cracked, their surfaces fogged over. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with fear. But as she stepped closer, she realized the reflections weren't hers. They were different, twisted versions of herself, their faces distorted, their eyes hollow. They grinned at her, their mouths stretching unnaturally wide, showing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. One of the reflections moved, stepping out of the mirror and into the aisle. Its body was warped, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Its eyes were pure black, just like the hooded man's. It opened its mouth, its voice a twisted echo of her own. "You can't leave. You belong here. With us." Samantha screamed as the other reflections began to move, crawling out of the mirrors, their bodies contorting, their hollow eyes locked on her. She turned and ran, her heart pounding as the whispers followed her. "Stay with us. Forever." She could feel them behind her, their cold fingers brushing against her back, their twisted faces grinning as they reached out to pull her into the shadows. She stumbled, her body trembling as she ran through the dark, endless aisles. No matter how fast she ran, the store kept changing, the aisles shifting, trapping her in an endless maze, and the whispers kept calling her name. Mia yawned as she stacked the last row of canned goods, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. It was her third closing shift this week, and the fluorescent lights above flickered annoyingly, casting eerie shadows along the Walmart aisles. She glanced at her watch, 12:15 a.m. The store was empty, as it always was this late at night. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional beep from the security cameras. She hated closing alone, but she needed the paycheck. She was just about to head to the back room when she heard it. A soft, shuffling sound. It was faint, almost like footsteps, but slower, dragging. Mia froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Hello? We're closed," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty store. Silence followed. She shook her head, laughing nervously at her paranoia. It was probably just her imagination. Turning back to the shelves, she continued to organize the cans. But the sound came again, this time closer, the dragging noise sending chills down her spine. She turned around, expecting to see a stray cat or a pile of fallen boxes, but the aisle was empty. Then she saw it, a shadow at the end of the aisle. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and perfectly still. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, her eyes glued to the dark figure. "Sir, ma'am, the store is closed." Her voice wavered, but the shadow didn't move. It stood there, motionless, its shape distorted by the flickering lights. She squinted, trying to make out its face, but there was nothing, just darkness. A chill ran down her spine as the shadow twitched, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. Then it moved, gliding silently across the floor, its body shifting as if made of smoke. Mia's heart raced as she stumbled back, her back hitting the shelf behind her. The shadow stopped, its head tilting the other way, its faceless void staring at her. A cold whisper echoed through the aisle, sending chills down her spine. "Do you see me?" Mia's heart pounded as she stumbled backward, her eyes locked on the faceless figure. It stood perfectly still, its body swaying slightly, its head tilted in that unnatural, disturbing way. She couldn't look away, her body frozen in fear. Then the lights above flickered, plunging the aisle into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, the figure was gone. Mia gasped, her body trembling as she looked around, but the aisle was empty. She ran to the end of the aisle, her eyes darting left and right, but there was no one there. The store was silent, the air cold and heavy. Her breath came out in shaky gasps as she tried to calm herself. "It's just your imagination, Mia. Just stress," she whispered, but the cold chill lingering in the air said otherwise. She hugged herself, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. Her walkie-talkie crackled, making her jump. "Mia, you good? I'm about to lock up the back door." Her coworker, Eric's voice came through, calm and casual. "Yeah, I thought I saw someone, but I guess it was nothing." she replied, her voice shaky. "All right, well, hurry up. It's creepy as hell in here at night." She forced a laugh, trying to sound normal. But as she turned to head towards the front of the store, she froze. The faceless figure was standing at the end of the next aisle, its head tilted, its body swaying ever so slightly. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched it move, its body gliding across the floor without making a sound. It didn't walk. It floated, its arms hanging limply at its sides. And then, slowly, its head began to turn. Mia's blood ran cold as the face twisted towards her, the darkness peeling away to reveal nothing. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface where a face should be. But she could feel it staring at her, its empty voids burning into her soul. Her body trembled as she took a step back, her foot hitting a fallen can. The noise echoed through the aisle, loud and jarring. The faceless figure's head twitched, its body jerking as if in pain. Then it lunged forward, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it reached for her. Mia screamed, turning and running down the aisle, her heart racing as the whisper followed her. "You see me. Now you're mine." Mia ran blindly through the aisles, her heart pounding, her breath coming out in ragged gasps. She could hear the faceless figure behind her, its body scraping against the floor, its limbs dragging as it followed her. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the empty store. "You see me. You belong to me." She turned a corner, her body slamming into a display of paper towels, sending them tumbling to the floor. She stumbled, but kept running, her legs trembling as she tried to escape the creature chasing her. But the store was changing. The aisle stretched longer, twisting into a maze of shelves that seemed to move on their own. Every corner she turned led her back to the same aisle, the same flickering lights, the same cold shadows. No, this isn't real. This can't be real," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But the whispers didn't stop. They surrounded her, cold and mocking, filling her mind with dread. The faceless figure appeared in front of her, its body twitching, its head tilting as it floated towards her. Mia screamed, stumbling backward as it reached out, its fingers stretching impossibly long, shadows swirling around them. She turned and ran, her body trembling as the shadows followed, reaching out like claws. Her vision blurred, the lights above flickering, casting distorted shapes on the walls. She could see faces in the shadows, twisted, hollow-eyed faces that grinned at her, their mouths wide and jagged. The shadows wrapped around her legs, cold and heavy, pulling her down. She fell to the floor, her body paralyzed as the faceless figure loomed over her, its head tilting, its empty void staring into her soul. It leaned in, its body bending in impossible ways, its fingers brushing against her face. The cold touch burned, sending icy pain through her body. It spoke, its voice hollow and empty. "You see me. Now you will be me." Mia's scream echoed through the store as the shadows consumed her, the faceless figure merging with her, its empty void becoming hers. The lights flickered once more, and then silence. Lena's heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she navigated the clothing section, straightening hangers and adjusting displays. The late shift at Walmart was always quiet, and tonight was no exception. The clock on the wall read 11:45 p.m., and the store was empty, save for a few night stalkers in the back. She hummed to herself, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that always crept in during the late hours. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, flickering every now and then, casting long shadows along the aisles. As she rounded the corner, she froze. One of the mannequins was standing in the middle of the aisle. It was turned towards her, its blank face staring straight ahead, its hand outstretched as if reaching for her. Lena frowned, her heart skipping a beat. She distinctly remembered arranging all the mannequins earlier, each one posed perfectly on the platform near the back wall. This one, it didn't belong here. She let out a nervous laugh, shaking her head. Come on, Lena, it's just a mannequin. Someone probably moved it as a joke. She walked up to it, placing her hands on its cold, plastic shoulders. It was heavier than she expected, its body rigid and solid. As she turned it to face the wall, she felt a chill run down her spine. Its head twisted slightly, its blank face seeming to follow her. Lena took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. She could have sworn its fingers twitched. She shook her head, laughing nervously. Get a grip. You're just tired. It's just a mannequin. But as she turned to walk away, she heard it. A soft, raspy whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent chills down her spine. Don't leave me. Lena's heart raced as she spun around, her eyes wide with fear. The mannequin stood motionless, its head turned toward the wall, its body stiff and lifeless. She stared at it, her breath coming in shaky gasps. I'm hearing things. It's just stress, she whispered, trying to convince herself, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She hurried down the aisle, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. The mannequin remained still, its figure slowly fading into the shadows as she turned the corner. She reached the customer service desk, her hands trembling as she grabbed the phone. She dialed the security room, her heart pounding. Hey, Tom. Are the cameras working in the clothing section? She asked, her voice shaky. Yeah, why? Something wrong. Tom's voice was casual, calm. I thought I heard something. Can you check the footage? Sure. Give me a sec. The line was silent as Lena waited, her eyes darting around the empty store. The air felt cold, heavy, like she was being watched. She hugged herself, shivering. Lena. Tom's voice came back, but it was different. Hesitant, almost afraid. What is it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The mannequin. It moved. Her blood ran cold as the phone slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. She took a step back, her body trembling. No, that's impossible. But then she heard it. A soft scraping sound. It was faint, coming from the aisle she had just left. Her body froze as she slowly turned, her heart pounding in her chest. The mannequin was there, standing at the end of the aisle, its head tilted, its blank face staring straight at her. Its hand was still outstretched, its fingers twitching ever so slightly. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she watched it move, its body jerking unnaturally, its head twisting at an impossible angle. It took a step forward, its foot scraping against the floor, its body shuddering as if fighting against invisible strings. Then, it spoke, its voice hollow and broken. Stay with me. Lena's scream echoed through the empty store as she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the tiled floor. The mannequin's voice followed her, broken whispers echoing through the aisles. Stay. Don't leave. She stumbled around a corner, her shoulder hitting a rack of clothes, sending hangers clattering to the floor. Her heart raced as she glanced back, but the aisle was empty. The mannequin was gone. Her breath came out in shaky gasps as she leaned against the wall, her body trembling. This can't be happening, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The lights above flickered, the buzzing growing louder, distorting the shadows on the walls. Lena's eyes widened as she saw them, twisted, hollow-eyed faces peeking out from behind the clothing racks. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes wide and empty. The shadows began to move, crawling along the floor, merging together, forming a dark, twisted figure. It stood up, its body hunched, its limbs long and jagged. Its face was blank, smooth, just like the mannequin's. Lena's body froze as the figure stepped forward, its head tilting as it watched her. It moved slowly, its limbs cracking and stretching, its fingers curling into claws. "You are mine," it whispered, its voice echoing through the empty store. She turned and ran, her body trembling, her mind racing. The shadows followed, crawling along the floor, reaching out like claws. She could feel them brushing against her ankles, cold and heavy. She stumbled through the store, the shelves twisting and warping, the aisle stretching longer. Every turn led her back to the same place. The clothing section, the mannequin standing in the middle of the aisle, its head tilted, its hand outstretched. Lena screamed, falling to her knees as the shadows wrapped around her, pulling her down. The mannequin's face loomed over her, its fingers reaching out, brushing against her cheek. "Stay with me forever,"